Okay, everyone, welcome to WOW Live, Word on Wednesday Live. It's our second Bible study in December of 2020, and we are on the trail of the giants in the land. Looking for giants in the land. We're looking to find out what we can about giants in the Bible. And tonight, after a short review, we're going to be searching for giants in the post-flood world. Now, last Wednesday, we focused on giants before the great flood of Noah's time. We zeroed in on the idea that the rebellious angels, the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6, deliberately sought to corrupt the bloodline of the human race for the purpose of preventing the seed of the woman of Genesis 3:15 from coming. Now, in Genesis 3:15, God the Creator cursed the serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, as he's described in the book of Revelation, chapter 12 and verse 9. But here we are back in Genesis 3:15, the first book of the Bible, where it says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." This is the first Christmas verse in the Bible, which means it's also the first gospel verse in the Bible, the first time the good news of Jesus is talked about, right in the beginning of the Bible, Genesis 3. The seed of the woman, implying a virgin-born individual, is going to come to crush the head of the serpent. In other words, destroy the work that Satan committed in the garden when he caused man to fall. And in the process, the seed of the woman himself shall suffer. Recall that we concluded from evidence found early in the early chapters of Genesis, we found that human blood would likely be needed to be shed in order to pay for human rebellion and sin. Certainly seemed to suggest that in the early chapters. We don't know how much of that Satan might have understood at the time, but we suspect he knew enough to know that he decided he needed to keep the seed of the woman, the Christ, from coming. I strongly suspect Satan, therefore, contrived this plot to work through rebellious angels to attempt to totally corrupt the human bloodline. Hence the very key story in Genesis chapter 6, which set the stage for God's great flood judgment. Genesis 6, 1-4. "Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them," human daughters, "that the sons of God, the angels, saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. That's a limit, a cap placed on human lifespan that will take effect after the flood in a gradual way. Going on, verse 4, our verse for this. "There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Thus the giants were born, the Nephilim, the hybrid race, part angel, part human. Violence increased in great magnitude, as these hybrids increased in population. We speculated that there may well have been an attempt not only to corrupt the human bloodline in the way we just described, but also a simultaneous effort to eradicate pure-blood humans. A kind of genocide to get rid of that pure lineage, so that this seed of the woman couldn't come. God was grieved in his heart at what he saw was happening as violence was increasing and things were being maligned and destroyed and corrupted. And in his time, he destroyed the world with the great cataclysm of the flood. Genesis chapters 7 and 8 talk about the flood specifically. And the only land creatures to survive were the ones that were on Noah's ark. Now, back in chapter 6, and I believe it's verse 9 of Genesis, because the Bible says there that Noah was perfect in his generations, I believe that means Noah's line was unspotted from corruption by rebellious angelic interference. It's reasonable to assume that Noah's sons were equally unspotted. Now, on the other hand, of particular interest is that little phrase that we find there in Genesis 6 and verse 4. There were giants on the earth in those days and also afterward, whenever the sons of God came in to the daughters of men and they bore children to them. There were giants on earth in those days, the days of the flood, the time of the flood, and also afterward. That strongly suggests giants also existed after the time of the flood. And notice that I've thrown that word whenever into the verse, in those brackets there. I put it there in place of the word when. It's my understanding that whenever is a legitimate translation of the Hebrew word used there. If I say, I will get milk when I go to the store, that sounds like a single trip to the store, right? It suggests I'm going to go to the store for other things, and while I'm there, I will also pick up some milk. But if I say, whenever I get to the store, I'll get milk, or, whenever I go to the store, I get milk, let's put it that way, not I will, but whenever I go to the store, I get milk, that carries a different meaning, doesn't it? It sounds like I'm buying milk every time I go to the store, implying that there's a lot of milk being used at my house. In like manner, to say that whenever the sons of God, or the angels, the rebellious fallen angels, whenever they procreated with human women, giants were the result, that gives one the definite impression that angels mated with humans more than just in a single event. And thus it sounds like more angels rebelled after the flood, and there was more than just one single incursion. And remember this, it can't be the same angels showing up after the flood that were there before the flood and doing this, because according to Peter and Jude, as we saw early on in our study, those angels have been detained in a holding place until the great judgment. Peter says in 2 Peter 2:4, God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to Tartarus, is the word used there, to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. And Jude says in verse 6, the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. So they committed their deeds, and then they were put away and taken out. So what about the giants then of the post-flood world? If whenever this happened, they were born. What happened there? Let's see what we can learn, and let's begin with Noah's son Ham. Remember a few lessons back we talked about the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. Here is an English rendering of what Genesis chapter 10, verses 6 through 8 says in the Septuagint. So this is from Genesis 10. Genesis 10, 6 through 8, the sons of Ham were Cush and Egypt, Put and Canaan. And the sons of Cush were Sheba and Havilah and Sabta and Raamah and Sabteka. The sons of Raamah were Sheba and Dedan. Cush begot Nimrod. He was the first to be a giant on the earth. Wow, the text there just told us that Nimrod was a giant, at least according to the Septuagint here. Now, the Greek word gigas is used. They use that for the translation, which does mean giant. The Hebrew word that's there in the original Hebrew text is gibor, which is most often translated as mighty one. In Genesis 6:4, you might recall that the giants there, the Nephilim, was the word used for giants, were called mighty men. That would be Gibborim. That's the plural form of Gibbor. Men of renown. Mighty men is the same word that we see in Genesis 10:8, Gibbor, Gibborim. For the record, we can say that all the giants in the Bible were mighty men, but not all of the mighty men in the Bible were giants. David has an elite fighting group of mighty men, great warriors all, that hung around him in his day, but they weren't giants. At least we aren't told that any of them were. Verse 8 says that Nimrod was the first to be a giant on the earth. Now, just to clarify a little bit, the writer here doesn't mean that Nimrod was the first one in history ever to be a giant on earth, because, well, the same writer just said in Genesis 6 that there were giants in the earth in those days. Context demands we give the writer the benefit of the doubt here, knowing that he means that Nimrod is the first giant on earth after the global flood. So that's what he's talking about. A bigger challenge for us in this verse, though, is Nimrod's ancestry, his family line. The Bible says that Cush, the son of Ham, who was the son of Noah, begat Nimrod. Now, you look at that, you've got Noah, Ham, Cush, Nimrod. I don't see any rebellious angels in that family line. From what we know elsewhere, specifically in Genesis chapter 6, you kind of need the angelic seed to produce giants with human women, and we don't see it here. But yet we have a giant, Nimrod. All right? Now, one could say that Ham's wife, Mrs. Ham, Cush's mom, okay, she may have had a Nephilim gene in her lineage somewhere from the time before the flood when that was out there. We could say something like that. But, see, here's the thing. That flood, as we know, was sent to wipe out that lineage, to get rid of that spot, that corruption that had happened. That was God's point, his purpose, his main point there. So it seems unlikely that the omniscient God would accidentally let some Nephilim heritage slip through the line at the ark unnoticed. You know, people waiting to get in line, kind of goes right in the door, sneaks off, and I got in. You know, I would give the Lord providential fiat on this one. I don't think that any Nephilim genetics made it onto the ark with the 8 people there. Now, we could also say maybe Nimrod wasn't really a giant after all. Maybe he was just a really strong, mighty man, okay? But is there another possibility, if we allow for some speculation, that is? Notice the first part of Genesis chapter 10, verse 7 here. This time we're going to do it from the New King James Version. Look at what it says. The sons of Cush, all right, Cush is our man, right? The sons of Cush were Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Raama, and Sabteka. These are 5 sons of Cush, the 5 sons. How come Nimrod doesn't make the list there? It's just 5 in that list. Now, you could almost say that because Nimrod was special, he therefore got special mention, separate from his brothers a little later on in the writing. Well, maybe. But that really kind of falls outside of the pattern for these genealogies in chapter 10. There's some other cases where someone's mentioned twice. They are mentioned twice because there's something special about them, and you know, it's not. It would be really it's kind of weird. It's rather atypical. It would have been more in line with the genealogy pattern to list Nimrod with his 5 brothers and then talk about the highlights of his situation and what he did, specifically singling him out. It highlights him even more if he's repeated twice in the text. So, there's these 5, and then there's Nimrod. Keep that in mind. There's another thing to note here about Cush and Nimrod. This time we see it in verse 8. And we're going to use the New American Standard Bible for this one, which is a good translation. I really like the NASB. It says now, verse 8 says, now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth, Nimrod did. Cush became the father of Nimrod. Other translations say Cush begot Nimrod. This one says Cush became the father of Nimrod. Now, strictly speaking, the Hebrew verb here that's used for begot or became, as the translation is in the NASB, and I will say this about the NASB, I don't have it on here, but they have a note in the text that says that word became also means literally begot, okay? So it's not like they got a different word there in the text they used. They just made it became the father of. Strictly speaking, the Hebrew verb that's used here has to do with the delivery of the child more than the conception of the child. The focus and emphasis is on the delivery. In numerous variations in meaning, getting this from, where did I get this at? A Concise Dictionary of the Words in the Greek New Testament and the Hebrew Bible. Okay, write that title down, it'll be on the test. I'm not going to give it to you again. If you weren't paying attention, you missed it. Anyway, to bear young, okay, is what this word means. To beget, to act as midwife. Okay, that's the person who shows up at birth, right? Specifically to show lineage, bear, beget, birth, born, make to come, bring forth children or young, bring up, even, calve, which is interesting, child, come, be delivered of a child. Okay, a child being delivered, time of delivery, gender, hatch, labor, do the office of a midwife, declare pedigrees, all these things having to do with once the child is born. So here's the speculation we're talking about. What if Cush's wife became pregnant by someone else? Somebody else is the biological father, not Nimrod, or not Cush, rather. And what if Nimrod's biological father was actually a rebellious angel attempting once again to corrupt, this time, Noah's lineage on the other side of the flood, trying to stop the coming of the seed of the woman? And what if this conception is actually the result of a rape, meaning that Cush's wife is not consenting to what is happening to her. It's forced upon her. And so then, given all that, what if Cush chose to raise the child, adopting Nimrod as his own son, and thereby he became the father of Nimrod? Now again, that's all speculation, all right? We don't have it in the text, but it's not a wild speculation, all right? It fits within experiences that people have today. Consider that Nimrod is being singled out in this text for a reason. Okay, there's a reason to focus on him. Nimrod overall does not have a good reputation among Jewish literature and so forth. In the Standard King James Version, it says something to the effect that Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Well, that's not, according to Jewish tradition, that's not a good thing. It sounds like, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Listen to what the Jewish Targum says about Nimrod. He was powerful in hunting and in wickedness before the Lord, for he was a hunter of the sons of men. He wants to have people rallying around him. He wants to get people to follow him and to give him credence. And he said to them, "Depart from the judgment of the Lord, and adhere to the judgment of Nimrod. Therefore is it said, as Nimrod is the strong one, strong in hunting and in wickedness before the Lord." Notice how, according to this ancient Jewish writing called the Jerusalem Targum, Nimrod is a hunter of the souls of men, meaning he wants to rally people around himself. He wants to have a following. He wants people giving themselves over to him so that he can have power over them. Nimrod says, don't go by what God says and decides. Stick with what I'm saying and deciding. Adhere to my judgment. Follow me, not the Lord. Okay? Now, Keep that kind of character in mind. Nimrod founded several cities, according to Genesis 10, effectively creating the first post-flood empire. There's no record of any pre-flood empires that I know of, and so he might be the one who founded the very first empire of all. And I think that's a likely possibility. At any rate, Genesis 10:10-12. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. All right, he's associated with Babel. All right, Erech is another place, kind of like Iraq. All right, Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ur, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. That is the principal city. So Nimrod led this rebellion against God at Babel. Come, let us make a name for ourselves. Let's build us a city and a tower, lest we be scattered over the face of the earth, right? And Nimrod may have been the very first post-flood giant, according to the Septuagint anyway, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So you have a giant leading this rebellion against God at Babel. The account of the rebellion at Babel is recorded for us in detail in Genesis 11, which we're not going to get into it tonight. But the event itself, that rebellion, is conservatively dated between 2200 and 2300 BC. Now that's roughly about 100 years after the flood, which was somewhere around 2400. This would mean there were angels who were leaving their abode, right, leaving their position, right after Noah and his family got settled in after the flood. Everything sort of settled down, and these guys get on it. They start leaving and departing in an effort to, again, corrupt human lineage. It's worth noting Noah would still have been alive at the time that his great-grandson Nimrod led this Babel rebellion. So what else in the post-flood world was happening regarding giants here? I've mentioned a few times in our studies of this topic that there are giant clans, meaning tribes and or families of giants that are mentioned in the Bible. And so far I haven't gone into any detail regarding that. Now would be a good time to do so. And the best place to begin is actually going to be a time around 900 years after the Tower of Babel. It's the end of the 40 years of Israel's wandering in the wilderness after their exodus from Egypt under Moses' leadership. So this is around 1400 BC, essentially. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, which is what we're going to read, during the course of this, Moses is kind of giving a review to the Israelites of what's happened on their journey so far. And in chapter 2, as the people are nearing the borders of the land that God had promised Abraham and his descendants, Moses is relating a little bit, here's what got us here kind of thing. And in Deuteronomy 2, verses 8 through 12, he says, "And when we passed beyond our brethren, the descendants of Esau, who live in Seir," now you'll notice that's on the wilderness of Edom there, the land of the descendants of Esau, so you can kind of see on the map what we're talking about there, "away from the road of the plain, away from Eloth and Ezion-Geber, or Geber, we turned and passed by way of the wilderness of Moab." That's further north, up around the eastern shore of the Dead Sea in the mountainous region, wilderness of Moab up there. "And then the Lord said to me, do not harass Moab, okay, nor contend with them in battle. For I will not give you any of their land as a possession, because I have given Ar to the descendants of Lot as a possession. Okay, so the Moabites, they're related to Israel through Lot. They're brothers of ours. Let's, leave them alone, is kind of what God is saying. And then verse 10, though, here's where it gets interesting now. "The Emim had dwelt there in Moab in times past. A people as great and numerous and tall as the Anakim." So there's a lot of them, and they're big. They were also, these Emim were regarded as giants like the Anakim, but the Moabites called them Emim. The Horites formerly dwelt in Seir, but the descendants of Esau dispossessed them and destroyed them from before them and dwelt in their place, just as Israel did to the land of their possession which the Lord gave them. So we read of two giant clans here in this passage, the Emim and the Anakim. The Emim, now the Anakim, we actually talked about them early on when we were in Numbers 13 and 14 for a brief time. And they talked about the Anakim there. We were like grasshoppers in their sight as the spies were looking over the land. Anyhow, so that's the Anakim. The Emim were in this land of Moab. There are two more giant clan names that surface here in Deuteronomy chapter 2. Let's look at verses 19 to 21. And this is Moses still talking about instructions that was given to them early on in their travels. And when you come near the people of Ammon, okay, the Ammonites, do not harass them or meddle with them, for I will not give you any of the land of the people of Ammon as a possession, because I have given it to the descendants of Lot as a possession. See, Ammon and Moab were brothers, basically, or cousins probably. It's kind of weird. Brothers is probably just as fine. Anyhow, half-brothers, I don't know. But they were related anyway. They were sons of Lot. And we won't go into all that story right now. But here again, this next section in parentheses, that was also regarded, Ammon was, as a land of giants, Rephaim. I put the Hebrew word in there for you because I want you to get familiar with that. It's an interesting word that keeps cropping up in the Bible in different ways and forms. Very interesting, Rephaim. Giants formerly dwelt there. The Rephaim formerly dwelt in Ammon. But the Ammonites called them, look at this, Zamzumim. Oh, I love that word, Zamzumim. A people as great and numerous and tall as the Anakim. Again, there's a lot of people, a lot of them, but the Lord destroyed them before them, and they dispossessed them and dwelt in their place. So the Hebrew word translated as giants in verse 20, as you can see, is the word Rephaim. Okay? And so like Nephilim, the word Rephaim is a more common word for giants in the Hebrew text. And then look at that fun word that the Ammonites called them, the Zamzumim. It's fun to say. So we have 5 names now for giants in the Old Testament that we've encountered: Nephilim, Anakim, Emim, Rephaim, and Zamzumim. These are people groups. They're families, tribes, or clans of giants. Now, while no female giants are mentioned by name in the Bible, nor are they really even brought up at all, it's obvious there were female giants in these clans. How else could you have families? It's not like the angels keep coming down and everything. And giants marrying giants would, of course, produce giants. And so now you've got this repopulating, group of these hybrids that are reproducing and growing in number. As we saw, there were many of them. After the flood, we have a possible giant named Nimrod, and 900 years later, you have these 5 giant clans. But there is one other place in the Bible that we can look for giants between Nimrod and the time of Moses, and that would be in the story of Abraham. Genesis 14, 1-4. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, be sure to write down all the names that I'm going to give you here, because they too will be on the test. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, there is no test, okay, just don't sweat it. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations. That would be Goyim. You see the Goiim region up there, Goyim, that's the Hebrew word for nations. So that's where Tidal came from. That they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, that's another fun word, Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. And you can see where these guys came from. You have kind of it's kind of hard for me to see the colors on this, but I believe it's an orange line coming out. There's a yellow line from Shinar, that purple line from Goyim. Is it a green one in there, or gray, or something? I can't see the color on this small picture I've got. But anyhow, that you can sort of track it there, not that that's what we're about. Verse 3 says, all these joined together in the valley of Siddim. That is the Salt Sea. So that's down there around Sodom, Gomorrah, Zeboim, right? Admah in there. And so you can see that at the bottom. That's where they all came together. These kings, Bera, Bersha, Shinab, Shemeber, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, for 12 years they served Kedorlaomer. Okay, he was over them. All right, he's kind of the reigning king. And in the 13th year, they rebelled, like they'd had enough for whatever reason, doesn't say. 4 kings from the Mesopotamian region, northeast of Canaan, they move out under the leadership of Kedorlaomer, the king of Elam. 5 kings around the Dead Sea, or the Salt Sea, they had rebelled after 12 years under Kedorlaomer, and he's coming with allies to quash this rebellion. That's what's going on. Verses 5 through 7 get interesting for us in our subject. In the 14th year, Kedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and attacked the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Amim in Shaveh Kiriathaim, and the Horites in their mountain of Seir, as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and attacked all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who dwelt in Hazazon Tamar. But look in there. The Rephaim are in this battle, giants, as are the Amim, the giant clans we just were introduced to. Here they are clear back in Genesis 14. We were in Deuteronomy 2, right? And the Zuzim, right there, is another word referring to the Zamzamim. Zuzim's kind of a fun word. 3 giant clans involved in this battle against the 4 kings from Mesopotamia. Now, this is in the time of Abraham, okay? And he's living in the region of Mamre there. You can kind of see it off to the side of where it says, and the Horites in their mountain of Seir. Right next to of is the word Mamre. Part of the M is covered up, but that's where Abraham is hanging out. All right, and his nephew Lot is way down in Sodom, down there close to the bottom of the Dead Sea. All right, this is about 500 years before the time that we read about in Deuteronomy 2, where we acquainted ourselves with those giant clans. Now we see these clans, they go back at least to the time of Abraham, and likely before that. So, the armies of the 4 Mesopotamian kings, from up north and east, they put the 5 kings of the Dead Sea area on the run, and they overcome them. And Kedorlaomer and his allies overtook Sodom and Gomorrah, and they took captives, including Lot, Abraham's nephew. Genesis 14:13-16. This kind of tells you what Abraham does. This is kind of neat. I just threw it in here because it's a cool story. Then one who had escaped came, got away from these kings that were taking these captives, and he told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre. You can see Mamre a little better on the map there. And the Mamre, the Amorite, okay, that's a guy's name, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and they were allies with Abram. Now, when Abram heard that his brother, meaning Lot, was taken captive, get this, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night. And he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah. See where Hobah is up there, which is north of Damascus, it says. So he brought back all the goods and also brought back his brother or nephew Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. Abraham, wow, what a guy. He has 318 militarily trained men in his own private militia, homegrown army. Right? Imagine what this rescue operation must have been like. You know, we think of Abraham, we think of him when he's old and he's waiting on a son and it's not happening and that kind of thing. You know, this guy was active in his day. We read a simple sentence in there. He divided his forces against them by night. And we don't pause to consider the intrigue involved there, the genius involved in the execution of that maneuver, the timing and everything else, in the dark, at night. The Bible is much more exciting and epic than our best modern thrillers. It really is. We're the ones who make the Bible boring for ourselves. We are, because we don't take the time to really study it out and get an idea of what's really going on. We just read words, I don't know what that means, and we keep moving on. But we need to figure out what's going on, and it becomes extremely exciting. The Star Wars saga pales in comparison to what God is doing in the spiritual warfare. Think about all this. I mean, we've been talking during this entire series about this trans-dimensional invasion of creatures from another created realm in God's cosmos. The heavenly realm, the angels coming through. And they've done so in response to their high commander, who has also, himself angelic, rebelled against the majestic, unified, triumvirate creator of all that exists. So he's throwing in this rebellion. This destroyer, in his rebellion, not only spurned the lordship of God, the creator, in the celestial realm, he also transgressed onto the terrestrial realm, leading the dominant stewards of that country, the human beings, into rebellion against the Lord and the creator of all. He's having a series of successes here. And in response to this insurrection, the Creator prophesies the sure and certain destruction of this castaway archangel and his would-be kingdom. The prophecy foretells that the anointed seed of the woman would trample upon the head of this corrupted serpentine celestial creature, crushing him in defeat. And in the process, the anointed one would suffer as well. The total deliverance and redemption of the terrestrial realm and its inhabitants rests upon this one single plan. There is no plan B. The Creator has one plan. And so, this serpentine rebel defines his objective as preventing the coming of this seed of the woman. And he hatches a plot involving underlings of his own celestial kind, who would commingle with the terrestrial kind, crossing that boundary between the kinds to corrupt their seed, thus ultimately preventing the seed of the woman from being born. The execution of this plot generates a hybrid race, a cross between the celestial and the terrestrial, of greater size than the humans, mighty creatures with high intelligence and extraordinary abilities. But they are evil in nature and wicked in behavior, with likely little and even no hope of any kind of redemption. What sort of eternity has been prepared for their souls? Almost pitiful creatures. It almost sounds like the mythology of some lost Atlantean civilization. But in truth, it is reality. A reality that precedes and therefore has served as the actual history from which all corrupted, degraded, and degenerate mythologies and false belief systems arose. They all find inspiration in the true story and embellish and create their own myths. So, think about this now with what we have seen, both before and after the flood. Noah's great-grandfather, Enoch, see him there about the fourth line. Well, he's above Noah by two spots there, Lamech, Methuselah, and Enoch, working up from Noah there. Enoch, whom Jude quoted in his New Testament book, Enoch would have seen giants for himself. The sons of God, rebellious angels, they came down during the time of Enoch's father, Jared, whose name means to come down. He was named for the event by his father, Mahalalel. So Jared has seen giants. Enoch has seen giants. Noah would have seen giants, encountered them, understanding that this Nephilim invasion, so to speak, was the main factor bringing on the judgment of the flood, because this had happened, and totally changing the course of Noah's life. Completely disrupted what that man was all about. Noah's son, Shem, had a great-great-grandson named Peleg. You can see him kind of in the upper middle of the page there with a box around his name, Peleg. His name means division. The Bible says it was in Peleg's day that the earth was divided, undoubtedly a reference to the confusion of the languages at Babel. So Peleg may well have seen Nimrod and possibly other giants as well, as would Peleg's father, Eber. The name for the Jews, Hebrews, may have come from Eber's name. Eber's Hebrew. You sort of can hear it there. Abraham certainly would have known of the giant clans. He was there in that battle we just saw in chapter 14 of Genesis along with them. So would have his son Isaac, his grandson Jacob, and the 12 great-grandsons who became the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. Later on, Moses would have seen giants. And his successor Joshua, King Og, by the way, of Bashan. Very interesting. Hopefully we'll get some time to get into him. But that's someone that Moses goes up against and the Israelites in Deuteronomy, I believe, or Numbers. I'll have to check that out. Anyway, Joshua, along with Caleb, would have fought against these giant clans in the conquest of Canaan because they were there. And about 400 years after that, David would have fought Goliath of Gath from the Philistines. And it may be that from Jared, Enoch's father, all the way to David, this is from Luke's genealogy in chapter 3, as you can see. If you go from that guy, number 7 on the list, to number 36, David, when you add up the years there, it adds up to nearly 2,500 years for the presence of giants on the earth. Considering that the flood really wasn't much of a break in the lineage at all, about a year or so, maybe a couple years or whatever, not much. If 2,500 years of giants on the land, if we went back 2,500 years from our time today, we'd be in and around the time of Daniel the prophet. That's a long time, folks. And we really don't know how long the giant population might have continued beyond David's time. Goliath did have 4 brothers who were giants. All right, we can read about them and hopefully will. That's why David selected 5 stones from the brook for his sling in case the brothers sought to avenge Goliath's death. He wanted to make sure he had enough ammunition to take them all out. A long time and a lot of giants. But why? Before the flood, the plot was to corrupt the human bloodline by intermingling angels with humans. Why does that persist after the flood? Because of the covenant that God made with Abraham, I think. Genesis 12, 1-3. Now the Lord had said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abraham is promised land for a great nation that would be made up of his descendants. All of the earth shall be blessed through him. And God has promised Abraham special protection, blessing any who bless Abraham and cursing anyone who curses him. Satan hasn't seen any human being get this much attention from God since Noah. Is it possible that the seed of the woman might come through Abraham? Is this what Satan begins to think? It might be worth trying to mess up this guy's lineage here. So maybe that's why giants start showing up again. Think about things and Satan's plans. Later in the Bible, we see an effort to wipe out all the Israelites when they're in Egypt, right? The Egyptians start trying to kill all the male Hebrew children, and Moses is saved by his mother Jochebed, put into a basket, and his sister watches over him in the Nile River. And then, during the days of Queen Esther, Haman the Agagite, he tries to eradicate all the Jews with a kingly edict that he pushes through. But he's caught and he's put to death. we would largely suspect Satan as the one behind these actions, taking an effort or making an effort to prevent Christ or the seed of the woman from coming. Now, we saw Abraham save the day, rescuing Lot and others that were taken captive by Kedorlaomer's coalition. That was in Genesis 14. Now, in Genesis 15, God restates his covenant to Abraham. And he shares with Abraham what amounts to a prophecy about what will happen to Abraham's descendants. Verses 13 through 16 of Genesis chapter 15. Then God said to Abram, "Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Now, as for you, Abraham, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. But in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." Interesting. Now, Abraham's descendants, the future nation of Israel, they'll be in another land, in Egypt, for 400 years, where they will be afflicted by the Egyptians. God will judge Egypt, and Israel shall come out of Egypt with great material blessings, and they will return to the land that God had promised to their patriarch, their founding father, Abraham. For 4 centuries, Abraham's family and descendants will be gone from the promised land. It's their land, but they're not going to be there for 400 years. That's what the prophecy says. They will return once the iniquity or the sin of the Amorites is complete. Then they come back. Now, the Faith Life Study Bible has this note on the phrase, the iniquity of the Amorites not being complete. The phrase, it says, shows that God does not displace those occupying the land because of favoritism. All right? It's not, like, well, I favor the Jews better than you, so we get rid of you. No, that's not the reason. He has a judgment against their abhorrent practices. This is judgment. It's not favoring one group of people over another. Some take this whole thing about cleansing of the land and as this ethnic cleansing sort of thing, and they blame God for that or something. And it cracks me up because it means they don't understand the Bible at all. There's a judgment coming against the people in that land. In Leviticus chapter 18, verses 24 and 25, God forbids the Israelites to be involved in the heinous pagan practices of those who had been inhabiting their land, a holy land, in their absence in Egypt. Leviticus 18:24 to 25. "Do not defile yourselves with any of these things, for by all these the nations are defiled, which I am casting out before you. For the land is defiled. Therefore I visit the punishment of its iniquity upon it, and the land vomits out its inhabitants." It's as though the land is being made sick by this infestation, and to clear itself, it vomits it out to get rid of the poison that's corrupting it. God knew that the Amorites would not repent. He allowed their evil, their iniquity, their sin to reach a point where he would then judge them. And Israel would be the arm of his judgment. And the giant clans also inhabiting Canaan are directly involved in these heinous practices as well. During that 400-year period, the land of Canaan becomes like a microcosm of the pre-flood world. Starts out being a good thing, promised blessing, and all kinds of wonderful things happening. And then Nephilim show up, giants occupying a land that became steeped in wickedness and evil practices and violence. As God sent a flood judgment in Noah's day, so he's going to send his people as his arm of judgment now upon the land. And the giants will be driven from the land almost completely. Next week, we'll search out what happens to those giant clans. Thank you so much for listening in today. God bless you. Have a great rest of your week. Take care, and stay tuned for information concerning our services in case anything changes this week with the governor possibly making announcements. I said something about it more in an earlier video that will be available for you to watch on Facebook as well, so you can get some more idea of what I'm talking about there. At any rate, God bless you, and take care.